Right now, in a museum in Moscow, there is a collection of gold jewelry that does not belong to Russia. Necklaces, diadems, a solid gold drinking cup made 4,000 years ago. Earrings so fine that modern jewelers struggle to replicate them with machine tools. A headband so delicate, it looks like it would dissolve if you breathed on it. 3 countries are fighting over this collection at this very moment. Russia says it belongs to them. Germany says it was stolen from them. Turkey says it was looted from their soil in 1873 and they want it back. The man who dug it up has been dead for 135 years. The city these objects came from has been built, burned to the ground, and rebuilt 9 separate times over 4,000 years of history. This is Troy, and if you think this story ended in ancient Greece, you have not been paying close enough attention. Troy is one of the oldest names in human memory. It appears in Homer, it appears in Virgil. Medieval kings from England to France to the Ottoman Empire claimed to be descended from its survivors. Alexander the Great slept with a copy of the Iliad under his pillow and wept at Achilles' tomb before invading Asia. The Sultan who conquered Constantinople in 1453 declared that he had finally taken revenge on the Greeks for what they did to Troy 2,500 years after the fact. A city earns that kind of grip on human memory for a reason. And the reason, it turns out, is not just the war. Before the war, there were 2,000 years of a city that survived by being smarter than everyone around it. A city that played the 2 greatest empires of the ancient world against each other for centuries and came out ahead every single time. Until it did not. This is the story of that city, the real one. To understand Troy, you need to understand where it sat. Find the narrow strip of water connecting the Aegean Sea to the Black Sea. Today we call it the Dardanelles. The ancient world called it the Hellespont. It runs 61 kilometers long and barely a kilometer wide at its narrowest point. It is one of the most strategically valuable pieces of water on the surface of the Earth. Every ship traveling between the Mediterranean and the Black Sea had to pass through it. Grain from the fertile plains north of the Black Sea, timber from the forests of the Pontic coast, copper and tin from the mines of Anatolia, gold, silver, wine, olive oil, all of it moved through that channel. There was no alternative route. Troy sat at the entrance to that channel, on a hill called Hisarlik, overlooking the mouth of the strait, with the plains of the Troad spread out around it and the sea visible from its walls. This was not an accident. Control the Dardanelles, and you control the lifeblood of Bronze Age commerce. You can tax passing ships, you can deny passage to your enemies, and grant it to your friends. In the ancient world, before banks existed, this kind of geographic leverage was the most durable form of wealth available. The city that sat at that entrance could grow rich without a particularly large army. It only needed to be there. For more than 2,000 years before the Trojan War, the city on that hill collected its share of everything moving through the strait. It grew rich, then it grew richer. It built walls, then it built better walls. And it had 2 very large and very ambitious neighbours who both had excellent reasons to want what Troy had. To the east, the Hittites, the first great empire of Anatolia, whose armies were capable of meeting Egypt in the field and fighting to a draw. To the west, the Mycenaeans, the Bronze Age Greeks, whose palace cities at Mycenae and Tiryns and Pylos were at the peak of their power. Aggressive, expansion-minded, with a navy that gave them reach across the entire Aegean. Troy was caught between them.
What the city did with that position over the following centuries is a story that almost nobody tells. The hill at Hisarlik has been continuously inhabited since approximately 3000 BCE. That is 500 years before the Great Pyramid at Giza was built. The Hittites, who kept some of the most meticulous administrative records of any Bronze Age civilization, knew Troy by a different name. They called it Vilusa. This is not a coincidence. In an older form of ancient Greek, the city was called Vilios, not Ilios. The W disappeared over time. Vilusa and Ilion are the same place, documented independently by two separate civilizations. That kind of double confirmation is as solid as ancient archaeology tends to get. The Hittite Empire rose to dominance in central Anatolia during the 17th century BCE. By 1450 BCE, they controlled most of what is now Turkey and were pushing steadily westward toward the Aegean.
At roughly the same time, the Minoan civilization on Crete collapsed, and the Mycenaean Greeks moved in to fill the gap. By 1400 BCE, the Mycenaeans controlled Crete and were the dominant sea power in the Aegean. Troy now had two expanding empires pressing toward it from opposite directions. The Western Anatolian kingdoms tried to resist together. They formed the Asuwa League, a confederation of 22 cities along the Aegean coast. Troy was a member. The Hittite king Tudaliya marched against the confederation and destroyed it. The member states were absorbed into the Hittite sphere one by one. Troy was not. And this is where the city's real political genius becomes apparent. While the other Asuan cities committed to direct resistance, Troy had kept its options open. When the dust settled, the city of Ilion was the one Western Anatolian power that had been neither conquered nor fully absorbed into either camp. In the decades that followed, Troy maintained friendly enough relations with the Hittite Empire to avoid being seen as a threat, and friendly enough relations with the Mycenaeans to keep the trade routes open. It extracted benefits from both sides and gave away as little as possible to either. A Hittite treaty from the early 13th century BCE records a formal vassal arrangement with a ruler of Vilusa. His name, as written by Hittite scribes in cuneiform, is Alexandru. Alexandru is the Hittite rendering of a Greek name, specifically the name Alexandros. In the Iliad, Paris, the Trojan prince whose actions trigger the entire war, carries a second name throughout the poem. Homer calls him both Paris and Alexandros, using the names interchangeably. Scholars have always assumed this was a literary convention, but here, in a clay tablet written 2 centuries before the Trojan War was supposed to have occurred, is a king of Troy named Alexander.
That treaty also invokes a divine witness. Among the gods listed to guarantee the agreement appears a name, Apollonius. This is the Hittite rendering of Apollo. The god Homer portrays as the special divine protector of Troy was already at home in the Trojan religious tradition 2 centuries before the war. Then the balance started to fray. What the fragmentary records suggest, pieced together from Hittite documents and Greek mythological tradition, is a Mycenaean military expedition against Troy in the late 13th century BCE. In Greek mythology, this appears as the campaign of Heracles against the Trojan king Laomedon. Heracles breached the walls, killed Laomedon, and killed most of his sons. One prince survived, a boy named Podarces, spared because his sister Hesione begged Heracles to accept him as a slave rather than kill him. She used a golden veil to pay his ransom. In doing so, she gave him a new name, Priamos. In Greek, it means something close to he who was ransomed.
You know him as Priam. The man who would preside over the final fall of Troy had already watched the city burn once. As a child, he had seen his father killed, and his brothers killed, and his home destroyed by Greek soldiers. He survived not because the Greeks showed mercy, but because his sister found a loophole. He rebuilt, he ruled, He fathered 50 sons and made Troy into a city so wealthy and so well defended that even Agamemnon, the most powerful king in Greece, would spend 10 years trying to break it. And he would watch it burn a second time. The second time, there was no sister to beg for him. Here is what Homer tells us. Paris, prince of Troy, travels to Sparta as a guest of King Menelaus. He falls in love with Menelaus' wife, Helen, and she either leaves with him willingly or is taken by force, depending on which ancient source you trust. Either way, Paris returns to Troy with Helen and a considerable portion of the Spartan treasury.
Menelaus calls his brother Agamemnon king of Mycenae. Agamemnon calls in every debt owed to him by every king in Greece. A fleet gathers at Aulis. 1,000 ships sail for Troy. What follows is 10 years of siege. The walls hold. Neither side can force a decisive outcome. The greatest warrior on the Greek side, Achilles, spends much of the war refusing to fight after a quarrel with Agamemnon. When his closest companion, Patroclus, is killed by the Trojan prince Hector, Achilles returns in a fury and kills Hector in single combat outside the walls. Then, Homer describes something that has kept the Iliad alive for nearly 3,000 years. Not a battle, not a triumph, something quieter than either. Priam, old and alone, dresses in common clothes and walks through the Greek camp in darkness. He reaches the tent of Achilles, the man who dragged his son's body around the walls of Troy behind a chariot, and he kneels before him. He asks for Hector's body back. He invokes the memory of Achilles' own father, also old and waiting. He says, "I have done what no man before me has ever done. I have raised my hands to the lips of the man who killed my children." Homer says Achilles wept, that Priam wept, that two enemies sat together in a tent, and each saw in the other a man who had lost something that could not be replaced. Achilles gives him the body. That moment, more than the battles or the wooden horse, is what has kept the Iliad alive for 3,000 years. An old king walking alone into the camp of the enemy and finding a human being on the other side. The fall of Troy itself comes after the Iliad ends. Achilles is killed by an arrow from Paris, guided by Apollo, finding the one point on his body that is not invulnerable, his heel. The Greeks construct a large wooden horse, fill it with soldiers, and leave it outside the gates as an offering. The Trojans drag it inside. That night, the soldiers climb out, open the gates, and the fleet returns from offshore. Troy burns. Priam is killed at the altar of his own temple. The women are enslaved. The structures that have stood for centuries come down in fire. Homer's Iliad gives its final pages not to the Greek victors, but to Andromache, weeping over Hector's body. The Greeks won the war. Homer gave Troy the dignity. Now, here is the question that historians and archaeologists have argued about for 200 years. Did any of it actually happen? By the 19th century, the scholarly consensus was clear. No, Troy was mythological. The war was mythological. The ancient Greeks had a well-documented tendency to treat their founding myths as literal history, and serious historians had stopped indulging that tendency. The problem with this position is that Homer is deeply strange for a work of pure fiction. The geography in the Iliad is accurate. The winds, the coastlines, the distances from Greece to northwestern Anatolia. Bronze Age armour and weapons are described with accuracy. A poet composing in the 8th century BCE had no particular reason to get right. Certain Mycenaean palace customs described in the poems correspond precisely to what archaeology subsequently confirmed. These details survived because they were the kind of concrete facts that audiences of oral poetry remembered and corrected when they were wrong. Homer was working with material describing events from 400 years before his time. The broad outlines may contain real events. The specific details, the names, the exact causes cannot be separated from 4 centuries of transformation in the telling. A war fought over trade routes becomes a war over a stolen queen. Events spanning decades compress into a dramatically satisfying 10 years. But here is the fact that reshapes everything else in this story. Around 1200 BCE, the Eastern Mediterranean world ended. Not declined, not weakened, it ended. The Mycenaean palace civilization collapsed completely and suddenly. Mycenae was destroyed, Tiryns was destroyed, Pylos burned. The administrative writing system of the Mycenaean bureaucracy, a script called Linear B, vanishes from the archaeological record. Writing itself disappears from Greece for 400 years. The civilization Homer was supposedly describing vanished so thoroughly that its successor cultures did not even know that writing had once existed among their ancestors. The Hittite Empire collapsed at the same time. The capital at Hattusa was burned and abandoned. The records stop. Ugarit, one of the most prosperous trading cities on the Syrian coast, was destroyed around 1185 BCE.
The last tablet ever found in its archives is a letter still being fired in the kiln when the city fell, reporting enemy ships sighted offshore and begging a neighboring ruler for military assistance. No reply was ever sent. Nobody came. Egypt survived, but permanently diminished. Cyprus was largely depopulated. Cities up and down the Levantine coast burned. Within roughly 50 years, almost every major civilization in the Eastern Mediterranean had collapsed or been reduced to a shadow of its former capacity. Historians call this the Bronze Age collapse. It remains one of the most studied and least explained events in all of ancient history. Troy was destroyed during this same period. The archaeological evidence confirms it, but so was everything else. If there was a Trojan War, it happened during a general catastrophe. The Greeks who sailed for Troy, if they sailed, were part of a world in the process of destroying itself.
Within a generation of the supposed fall of Troy, the Mycenaean civilization that produced Agamemnon and Achilles was itself gone. The warriors who burned Troy returned to a Greece that was entering 400 years of poverty and illiteracy. 400 years later, when writing returned to Greece and the first poets began fixing the old oral stories in written form, what they were working with was the fragmented memory of a civilization that had destroyed itself, of great kings and high walls and ships beyond counting, and a war that ended a world. They made it into the Iliad. In 1868, a German businessman named Heinrich Schliemann arrived in Greece with a copy of Homer in his bag and a determination to prove the entire academic establishment wrong. He was not an archaeologist by any formal definition. He was a self-made millionaire who had accumulated his fortune through trading ventures across several continents, not all of them conducted with the strict honesty he later claimed in his memoirs. He had made money in Russia, supplying military goods. He had made money in California during the gold rush. By his mid-30s, he was wealthy enough to retire, and what he chose to retire to was Homer. What Schliemann rarely received credit for was this: he did not find the site of Troy himself. A British diplomat and part-time archaeologist named Frank Calvert had been excavating the hill at Hisarlik for years on his own account. Calvert had concluded, through patient scholarly work, that Hisarlik was the site of ancient Troy, and he had done the initial test excavations to support that conclusion. When Schliemann arrived in the region looking for Troy, Frank Calvert was the man who pointed him to Hisarlik and showed him where to dig.
History is written by those with the money to publish their findings widely. Calvert had none. Schliemann had plenty. He began excavating in 1870 with Ottoman government permission and his own funding. His methods were aggressive. He used explosives. He cut trenches through the hill at a pace that left little time to study what was being uncovered before it was destroyed. What he did not know was that the hill contained not one ancient city, but many, each built on the ruins of the one before it. He was cutting through centuries of history he had not yet had time to read. On the morning of May 31st, 1873, something caught his eye in the freshly turned earth near the ancient city wall. He sent his workers away, excavated the find himself, and over the following hours pulled out a collection of Bronze Age gold objects unlike anything found anywhere in the world to that point. Copper and bronze vessels, a large silver vase,
A headband made of more than 16,000 individual gold pieces connected by fine chains, 2 diadems of extraordinary craftsmanship, earrings, bracelets, necklaces. Schliemann called it the treasure of Priam and announced it to the world immediately. It was not Priam's treasure. The layer he found it in dated to approximately 2400 BCE, more than 1,000 years before the Trojan War was supposed to have occurred. The layers most likely to correspond to Homer's Troy were the ones his dynamite had already cut through. But the announcement circled the globe. Photographs of Sophia Schliemann wearing the diadems appeared in newspapers across Europe. The treasure was unquestionably real and unquestionably ancient. The Ottoman government noticed it had not appeared in any of Schliemann's formal reports. They launched legal proceedings. The treasure was already outside Turkey. Schliemann eventually paid a settlement and donated some objects to the Ottoman Imperial Museum. The main body he kept, then eventually donated to the Royal Museums of Berlin, where it went on public display. In the spring of 1945, as Soviet forces closed in on Berlin, the treasure of Priam was moved from the museum to a reinforced concrete bunker beneath the Berlin Zoological Garden. Soviet troops found the bunker. The gold was loaded onto military trucks heading east. For nearly 50 years, the Soviet government denied having it. In 1994, the Pushkin Museum of Fine Arts in Moscow quietly disclosed that the collection had been in its storage facilities for decades. It has remained in Moscow ever since. Russia calls it a legitimate acquisition under the laws of war. Germany calls it looted property. Turkey says neither country ever had a valid legal claim to objects that were illegally removed from Turkish soil in 1873. The treasure of Priam has been absent from the ground where Schliemann found it for 150 years. No resolution is visible on the horizon. Objects from a city whose history was defined by disputes that no one could resolve peacefully have spent the decades since his death being argued over by governments that show no sign of reaching agreement. Priam, if he existed, would probably have recognized the pattern. After Schliemann, excavation at Hisarlik never really stopped. His principal successor, Wilhelm Dorpfeld, worked a site in the 1890s and established something Schliemann had missed. The mound contained not one ancient city, but 9 distinct layers, now labelled Troy I through Troy IX, spanning from approximately 3000 BCE to the Byzantine era. Troy II, where Schliemann found the gold collection he called Priam's treasure, dates to roughly 2400 BCE, over 1,000 years before the Trojan War. He had found a real Bronze Age treasure from a real city on this hill. He had simply found the wrong century. Troy VI and Troy VIIa are the layers that matter. Both date to the 13th and 14th centuries BCE, the right period. The architecture of Troy 6 is substantial. The walls are genuinely impressive. Both layers show clear signs of violent destruction. Human skeletal remains with embedded bronze arrowheads in the Troy 7A layer suggest real combat. Patterns of structural collapse in Troy 6 suggest seismic activity. The record is damaged enough that certainty may not be possible. What more recent work has added changes the mental picture of the city significantly. In the early 21st century, survey teams used ground-penetrating radar across the entire area surrounding the citadel. What they found was that the citadel Schliemann had excavated was only the palace district of a much larger settlement. The lower city, extending around the base of the hill, covered an area 10 to 15 times the size of the inner fortress. The Troy of the Late Bronze Age was not a small palace city.
It was a substantial urban centre, with a population that may have reached into the tens of thousands. The walls Schliemann found were the walls of the royal compound. The actual city spread far beyond them in every direction. This changes the Trojan War from implausible to possible. A coalition of Greek kings willing to maintain a 10-year siege makes considerably more sense if the target was genuinely large, genuinely wealthy, and genuinely worth the commitment. The small fortified hilltop of the standard imagination could not have justified it. The city, revealed by the radar surveys, could have. Whether a Trojan War happened here, we cannot say with certainty. What we can say is that this city was real, it was important, and its destruction was significant enough to leave ruins that sailors and merchants stared at for centuries while passing through the Hellespont. Those ruins became the foundation of a story that has never stopped being told.
Alexander the Great, preparing to invade the Persian Empire in 334 BCE, made his first act on Asian soil a visit to what he believed was the tomb of Achilles. He ran around the tomb, left a wreath, and reportedly wept. He was already carrying a copy of the Iliad, annotated by his personal tutor Aristotle, under his pillow at night. This was not sentiment, it was strategy. Alexander was positioning himself as a new Achilles, framing his invasion not merely as a military campaign, but as the continuation of a story that had been running since the Bronze Age. Rome took the same story and extended it further than anyone had expected. The poet Virgil, writing under the patronage of the Emperor Augustus, composed the Aeneid, the story of Aeneas, a Trojan prince who survived the fall of Troy and eventually reached Italy. His descendants founded Rome. The city the Greeks had burned came back as an empire that eventually conquered Greece itself. Julius Caesar claimed descent from Venus through the Trojan royal line. Augustus used the Aeneid as a foundational document for his new imperial order. The people who destroyed Troy became the people who remembered themselves as Troy's heirs. The story did not stop with Rome. The Ottoman Sultan Mehmet II, after taking Constantinople in 1453, is reported to have said that he had finally taken revenge on the Greeks for the sack of Troy, that the peoples of Asia had at last had their answer after 2,500 years. Whether he said it in those exact words or not, the sentiment was documented and understood as legitimate. In 1453, the Trojan War was still living politics. The story also left marks that are invisible to the people who carry them. The tendon connecting the calf muscles to the heel bone is called the Achilles tendon. Doctors have been using that term in clinical settings for centuries. Every time a sports commentator mentions an athlete's Achilles tendon, Homer's war travels forward in time again. The word Odyssey, used in English to mean a long and difficult journey, comes directly from Homer's account of Odysseus spending 10 years trying to get home from Troy. The English word has been in active use for roughly 27 centuries. In cybersecurity, a Trojan horse describes malicious code hidden inside apparently legitimate software. The metaphor is 3,000 years old. It remains the clearest way to describe the concept, which is why security professionals use it rather than inventing something new. And through all of it, in the storage rooms of the Pushkin Museum in Moscow, the gold jewelry waits. 3 governments argue about where it belongs. The man who found it named it after a king who may or may not have existed. The city it came from was destroyed so thoroughly that we are still not certain what destroyed it. Troy was burned 9 times. 9 times, something survived. A story, a name, a piece of gold small enough to carry in a shirt. The Greeks burned the city. The city became the story the Greeks told about themselves for the next 1,000 years. Rome conquered Greece. Rome called Troy its mother. The Ottomans took Constantinople. The Sultan called it revenge for Troy. Soviet soldiers took the treasure. The world is still arguing about it. 9 destructions. Troy lost the war. Troy won everything else.